but became famous for the movie Sixth Sense, and then shortly thereafter made a movie called Signs. How many of you have seen Signs? All right, for those of you that have not seen Signs, and you've been waiting 10, 15 years to watch Signs, I'm about to ruin the entire movie, so you might want to leave and then come back in about 3 minutes. So the gist of the movie is this, and I'm going to try to get through it as quickly as I can. There's a man named Graham. He lives in his farmhouse with his 2 kids and his brother. His son is named Morgan. Morgan has severe asthma. And his daughter's name is Bo, who randomly leaves cups of water all over their house for no apparent reason. Half empty cups of water. Graham also lives with his brother named Merrill. Merrill is a failed minor league baseball player, former jock in high school, really popular and, a bit cocky. Graham, the dad, is a former priest, but his wife was killed in a car accident and he lost his faith and left the ministry. And so this sounds like a really nice, it's really just an alien movie. I mean, for those of you that haven't seen it, it's an alien movie. But what happens is they wake up one day and notice that there's a crop circle in their farm, and then they notice that there's a man outside watching them, and it's this weird dark figure. And then they start to see reports on the news about other crop circles all over the world, and lights over Mexico and all this stuff. And clearly the aliens have showed up. Well, I'm going to fast forward as fast as I can. So at one point they're listening to this baby monitor, and they hear crackly, talky, alien-y noises, and they're freaked out. And then a few days later, Graham, the dad, is talking with Merrill, the brother, and he tells him the story of the day that his wife died. And he says that her last words were, "Tell Merrill to swing away." Tell Merrill to swing away. I mean, didn't make any sense. He didn't really understand. He just figured she was delirious because of the accident. But still, it was strange. So, fast forward another day, they hear some weird alien-y noises on their baby monitor, and they get freaked out knowing that the aliens are really here, and they run to their basement to hide. They barricade themselves in. Surely they're ended up, being aliens. And Morgan, remember the son, who has asthma, starts to have an asthma attack, and he starts making lots of noise. And the aliens find them, and they start to bang down the door, but they keep the aliens out. And Graham, the dad, all night long sits with his son and helps him get through that asthma attack without any medicine. So they wake up the next morning, they're listening to the radio, and they hear that as quickly as the aliens came, they left. And so they're free to get out of the basement. Well, they open up the door, and Graham, the dad, goes into the living room to get medicine for his son, Morgan, and walks in and notices an alien holding his son, lifeless, barely breathing, waiting to shoot a toxin into his face to try to kill him with this, alien pointy toxin delivery method. So Graham stands lifeless. Merrill, the brother, walks in. He sees he's standing lifeless. And all of a sudden, Graham remembers the conversation that he had with his wife. And he looks on the wall, and there's a bat that commemorates his time in the minor leagues. And a record that he said, I don't remember what it was, like 407-yard home run, which for a non-baseball watcher, I have no idea what that means. Is that good? I don't even know. So anyway, is that good? 407 yards? There you, feet. Yeah, there you go, feet. Yeah, 470 yards would be pretty far. That would be really far. So anyway, so they're sitting there. So Graham says, swing away. So he looks at Merrill, and he says, Merrill, swing away. And Merrill says, oh. And he says, Merrill, swing away. And Merrill looks at the bat, looks at the alien, gets the bat, grabs the bat, starts to walk toward the alien. Well, before he can, the alien shoots the toxin in Morgan's face. And he walks up, hits the alien falls, drops Morgan on the ground. Graham, the dad, grabs the son, runs outside to give him medicine. And we see Merrill hit the alien again, And the alien falls down, and one of those random cups of water falls off of the shelf. The water hits the alien on the shoulder, and it acts like acid and burns away at his skin. So then they look at the little girl, Bo, like, oh, right, maybe you're not crazy. So the scene flashes outside to the dad with the son, trying to give him medicine, scared to death because he shot this toxin in his face, and he's so scared and his son's going to die. Well, lo and behold, because of his asthma attack, his lungs were so closed that the toxin didn't get into his lungs, and it saves his life. The camera goes back inside, and we see Meryl walking around, the alien, and Meryl's hitting glasses of water that are all over the house, spraying water all over this alien. Eventually, he kills him. The last scene of the movie, there's not a lot of dialogue, but what we do see is Graham, the father, getting dressed. And at the end of the movie, we see him put on a priestly collar. The assumption is that he's got his faith back, right? It's hard sometimes to understand the significance of things in your life until they're all put together, right? All of us have had experiences in our lives that seem completely random and pointless. And they can cause us to lose our faith. Without God's perspective, without an idea that all of this is planned and nothing is an accident, it's hard to not lose your faith. And this morning, what we're going to talk about is a man named Joseph. Joseph is a guy who is talked about in the book of Genesis in more than a third of the book of Genesis. So this is a huge character in the first book of the Bible. I'd love to read through the whole thing, but that would take a long time. So we're not going to do that. But I would love for you, while we're talking, to open up your Bibles if you have them in front of you, or again, if you have a Bible app on your phone, whatever your preferred method is. Because we are going to read a few verses along the way, and I want you to actually read them with your own eyes, because they're going to be pretty important. I want to tell you where we're going today. I'm just going to tell you my 3 points. I got 3 points in a poem. At the end, I'm just kidding, I don't have the poem. I have 3 points. I'm going to tell you what they are. You're going to know exactly where we're headed, all right? Point number 1. God plans for the good. God plans for the good. Number 2. God remains. Despite circumstances, despite time, God remains. Number 3. Love suffers to save lives. That's what we've been talking about, right? A definition of love. Trying to see what God does in the Bible to get a picture of what true love is. Because the world tells us all kinds of things about what love is. But the only true definition of what love is God. Because God is love and He's perfect love. Jeremiah chapter 29 and verse 11 is a very famous passage. A lot of you will be familiar with. It says, "For I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord. Plans for welfare and not for evil, to give you a hope, a future and a hope." All right, a lot of you have heard that passage. And I think that it's an amazing, amazing passage in the Bible. All of them are amazing, right? But that this is particularly amazing. But here's, I think, one of the things that we might have lost these days. Notice what it says. I know the plans I have for you. God has plans. But here's my question. If we don't believe that God has the power to actually carry out those plans, then that verse is pretty meaningless, isn't it? I mean, what's the point in having a God that's unable to actually bring anything about, and then He says, I got some good plans for you? I mean, there's no point. And that's the most important part, I think, the underlying principle of that verse. We believe in a God that has the power to change the outcomes of the world around us, right? We believe in a God that shapes the hearts of men and women. We believe in a God that knows the thoughts of men and women before they know them themselves. We believe in a God who decides the victors in wars. That's the God we believe in. And so when God says, I know the plans that I have for you, welfare and not evil, well, that's a God that's saying that from a place of power to actually make things happen for us in our lives. And so that's why it gives us hope and encouragement. That's why. We have to believe in his power to bring good things about. If he doesn't have the power and he's inept, then all these verses are meaningless. In Genesis chapter 15, God makes a covenant with Abraham, the first patriarch of the faith, so to speak. God makes a covenant with Abraham. He makes a promise with him. And he says a lot of things, but one of the things that he says is, your people are going to be oppressed for 400 years in a foreign land, and one day they're going to leave with great wealth. And that's the beginning of what ends up being the people of God in the Bible, that whole process. That shapes what the Bible ends up talking about as the people of Israel. That's the beginning. But there's a lot of time between Abraham and Moses. A lot of time. So how is that going to happen? Well, those of you that know the story of Moses, you end up seeing that. They're in slavery for 400 years. And then when they leave Egypt, they leave with all kinds of riches. But it's one thing to know that that's going to happen, and it's a whole other thing to make that come about. And that's what God does. In Genesis chapter 37, again, we're not going to read the whole story, so I'm going to give you background and all this kind of stuff. In Genesis chapter 37, Joseph is fairly young and has a bunch of dreams. He has dreams that his brothers are bowing down to him. His dreams that his parents and everyone are bowing down to him. Now, just a word of advice. If you have dreams like that at any point, I would encourage you to not share that with the people that are bowing down to you, because it doesn't go well for Joseph. Or maybe you should, because it ends up going well for him. Joseph has a dream that everyone's bowing down to him, and his brothers don't like it. So his brothers sell him into slavery and tell their dad that he's dead. He's gone. Joseph is then given to a man named Potiphar, an Egyptian named Potiphar, to serve him as a slave. Now I want you to imagine just for a second that that was you, and that you had these brothers. They were your family, the people that were supposed to love you, and they desert you. And they don't just desert you. They didn't just say, you're out of here, you're shunned. I mean, they sold him into slavery. They left him for dead. And then he's given to Potiphar to serve him forever. And this is one of the verses that I want to read. Then we come up to this really, really cool phrase. Genesis chapter 39, in verse 2. It says that he's taken to some traders and eventually given to Potiphar, an Egyptian officer. And verse 2 says, the Lord was with Joseph, so he succeeded in everything he did as he served in the home of his Egyptian master. The Lord is with Joseph. Amazing. All of these horrible things are happening, and yet it tells us that God is with him and that he's making him succeed. So fast forward, Joseph is being a good guy, doing what he's supposed to do, obeying God, and Potiphar has a wife. Now Potiphar liked Joseph, and Potiphar's wife liked Joseph. And Joseph continued to try to do the right thing. He stayed away from her. He knew that it wasn't right for him to get involved. And she pressed. Well, one day she presses hard and grabs onto him, and he tries to run away, and as he runs away, she grabs his shirt off his back, or a portion of his shirt. And she then tells a lie to her husband that Joseph, was, being inappropriate. And so Potiphar throws him in prison. And yet, in chapter 39, in verse 21, it says, but the Lord was with Joseph in the prison and showed him his faithful love. It's just crazy. It's just crazy. So Joseph is in prison now. And he because of God's actions, becomes very influential in the prison, ends up overseeing a lot of the prisoners. Well, one day the cupbearer and the chief baker for the Pharaoh, the king, the guy that's in charge of all of Egypt, make the Pharaoh mad. So the cupbearer and the chief baker get tossed in prison. Well, Joseph's there taking care of them. He's tending to their needs as, this kind of man would. And, well, okay, hold on. So let me pause. I think that there's interesting things that happen in us in general as people. I think that it used to be, like I remember as a kid sitting and I do this to my kids, so I feel bad for them, I guess, but I remember sitting at the dinner table and I would be complaining about whatever I was eating, and my parents would say, and I don't know for those of you that are in that generation, my parents would say there are starving children in Africa, right? Right, exactly. There's starving children in Africa that would love to have overcooked roast beef. So quit your whining. All right? So I think that used to be that we compared ourselves to people, and I'm not saying it's good to compare yourself to people, but we used to compare ourselves to people kind of in a good way. We used to look at other people and say, man, they've got it bad. I really shouldn't complain as much as I do. I think an interesting shift is happening in our culture now where we're so self-centered and absorbed that we don't do that anymore, I don't think, as often. We validate a lot of the junk we're going through sometimes, I think. We don't do that as much, at least for me. I think that what I end up doing is, I don't have that like starving children in Africa conversation. I just have a pity party. I just feel horrible for myself. I just talk about how bad things are. I mean, poor Lorraine asked me how my week was in the hallway, and I talked to her for 10 minutes about how miserable my week was. And then I standing up here and preaching to you guys. I don't know how that works. But that's what I do, right? Maybe I'm alone, but I don't think I'm alone. So here's the thing. There are times where we should look at stories and say, this guy has it bad. Joseph had it bad. Okay? This isn't just a story. This is a real man who was left for dead, sold into slavery by the very people that were supposed to protect him, lied about, thrown in prison. Joseph had it bad, guys. Bad. And look at him. He doesn't, we don't hear about all of this horrible stuff that Joseph does in response. We don't hear that Joseph does anything horrible at all. We can assume that he just keeps trusting God. He does the right thing over and over and over again. So then he meets the cupbearer, and the cupbearer has a dream. And Joseph says to the cupbearer, I can interpret your dream. So he interprets the cupbearer's dream, says that he's going to end up going back to Pharaoh, serving him just like he used to. And he says, please remember me when you leave. Well, comes to pass. Cupbearer gets released. And he waits. And he waits 6 months. Nothing. Joseph's still in prison. He waits a year. Nothing. Joseph's still in prison. He waits a year and a half. Nothing. Joseph's still in prison. He waits 2 years. Nothing. Joseph's still in prison. And he sits there. Despite the fact that he did the right thing, despite the fact that he was correct with his interpretation, despite all those things, he sits there and the cupbearer doesn't remember him at all. And so he does each of these things, and you'd think that good things would come, right? He obeys God, and he goes to Potiphar, he serves Potiphar well, hits temptation like all of us do, and he says no. And you'd think that good things would happen. Have you ever thought that way before? I mean, I think that way, right? Look, God, I was like temptation. I did great. I only ate 3 cupcakes instead of 4. And now, like, all this horrible stuff is happening to me. What kind of a God are you? Right? That's what we do. I complain when I'm in traffic. I question God's existence when I run out of ketchup. You see what I mean? That's a crisis of faith moment. The ketchup. How do you eat a hot dog without ketchup? Mustard people. You get out. Do you see what I mean? Joseph had a raw deal. We don't have it half as bad. I want to show you something. Turn with me, chapter 41, and verse 14. So 2 years later, we hear nothing from Joseph, and Pharaoh has a dream. And Pharaoh has a dream that no one can interpret. And the cupbearer finally remembers Joseph. Tells Pharaoh about Joseph. And Pharaoh says, I want to see that guy. And in chapter 41 and verse 14, we see this. Pharaoh sent for Joseph at once, and he was quickly brought from the prison. After he shaved and changed his clothes, he went in and stood before Pharaoh. Now I want to pause, okay? So for those of you that are here this morning that struggle to believe the words in this book, to believe that they're real, that they're historical, and then to believe that they're from God. There's a trend these days where folks go through the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and they talk about the mundane things that are mentioned. You know, when people write books and literature, they don't put in needless detail if they're lying. They don't say, share random, there's so many things in the Gospels that just, why would you need to know that? Now I have a question. Why do I need to know that Joseph shaved and changed his clothes? It doesn't help the story at all. It serves no purpose whatsoever. He simply shaves and changes his clothes. It has no significance at all to the story. Things like that you read in the Bible show you that these are real stories. These are real people. Joseph was in prison for years. The dude was stinky and probably had a beard-ish or something, right? He needed to shave and clean himself. It doesn't serve the purpose of the story, but what it does is shows us this is a real situation. Imagine that. Imagine you're now in prison, and then eventually they say, all right, come on out. And you're cleaning yourself up and putting clothes on and getting a shave maybe for the first time in who knows how long. And so he cleans himself up, and let's read the rest. Pharaoh says to Joseph, I had a dream last night, and no one here can tell me what it means. But I've heard that when you hear about a dream, you can interpret it. Now listen to this. Verse 16. It is beyond my power to do this, Joseph replied. But God can tell you what it means and set you at ease. 2 years, nothing. Years before that of being thrown into slavery and left for dead and lied about. And the first things that we hear Joseph say are, God can do great things, not me. He's able to do great things, not me. Awesome. I don't do that. I don't experience one kick after another and somehow focus magically on how big God is. I lose sight of that. Those circumstances impact me, and they shouldn't. They shouldn't impact me. They shouldn't impact you. Joseph knows what the dream is about. It's about a famine. It talks about 7 years of plenty and 7 years of famine. He says that you need to store up and prepare for this famine because it's going to be bad and lots of people are going to die. And so Pharaoh thinks about who he wants to put in charge of that effort, and lo and behold, who does he think of but Joseph? And so Joseph becomes the man that heads up the effort to store up what's needed to be stored so that the people can be saved. And so you start to see, right, how God's promise to Abraham is slowly being worked out. That way back in Genesis 15, now God makes a promise to Abraham. And then slowly over time, we now see one of his people in a position of power in Egypt. And all of those things had to get pieced together in order for him to make it to that moment right at that point in time. You see how they're strung together, right? If Joseph hadn't been left for dead and sold to slavery, he would have never met Potiphar and given to Potiphar and made his way to Egypt, right? And if he not known Potiphar, then he never would have known Potiphar's wife. And if he didn't know Potiphar's wife, then Potiphar's wife would have never said, ooh. And if he never knew Potiphar's wife, then she would have never lied about him, and then Joseph would have never been thrown in prison. If he wasn't thrown in prison, he never would have met the cupbearer. And if he met the cupbearer and interpreted his dream, he never would have been known to be someone who could interpret dreams. And if he wasn't known as someone who could interpret dreams, and when the cupbearer was with the Pharaoh, and he told the Pharaoh about Joseph, he never would have been able to tell him that. So he never would have pulled him out of prison to ask him to interpret that dream, which meant that he never would have been put in charge of this effort to save all of these people. Do you see? You can't have one thing and not the rest. It all fits together. God works and makes these things come about. That's God's plan. So Joseph gets put in a position where he can now save lives. He can now save lives. I have a question for you. 30 seconds of silence feels like a real long time, but we're going to try it. I want you right now, everybody in this room, to think back over your life. Start till right now. I want you to think about where you were born, who your parents were, if you knew them. I want you to think about all of the big experiences that have happened in your life, that have shaped you, both good and bad. Think about that for a minute. Now, I'm here to tell you something today. I'm not telling you that all of those things happened so that you could be here right now. I'm not saying it's causal. I don't think that I or this moment is that big. For some of you, it might be. But I don't think that God brought all these things about so that you could be here. But here's what I can tell you. If all of those things hadn't happened, you wouldn't be sitting here right now. Right? You would not be sitting here right now if you didn't have the job you have, and the family you have, and the house you have, and the upbringing you had, and the first job you had, and the first job you lost. You wouldn't be sitting here right now. Listen to me. Listen. Your life is not an accident. The things that have happened in your life are not good fortune or a series of unfortunate events. Your life is not an accident, and you are here for good reason. You're here to hear that right now. You're here to hear that right now. Nothing that has happened in your life was accidental. Everything that has happened in your life has been shaped by God Himself to make you who you are and bring you to where you are right now. Joseph, in chapter 50, after he stores up all the grain and protects all the folks and prepares for the famine, Joseph ends up meeting his brothers again. Same brothers that sold him down the river. And in chapter 50, in verse 20, he looks them in the eye for the first time in who knows how long. Now I've got a question for you. When I asked you to think about your life, some of you thought about some bad stuff. Right? Some bad stuff. Some bad stuff that you would never want anybody in this room to know. It's that bad. Some of you thought about bad people. And I want you to imagine that you had the opportunity to look them in the face right now. That somehow you were given that opportunity. What would you say? How would you respond to those people that caused you so much harm? Let's see what Joseph says. Joseph, let's read it right from the text. Chapter 50. Joseph says to them, verse 19, he says, "Don't be afraid of me. Am I God that I can punish you? You intended to harm me, but God intended it all for good. He brought me to this position so I could save the lives of many people." What a perspective, right? He didn't get so lost in the moment that he couldn't pull back and see the bigger thing that God was doing. See the meta-narrative of the story. Joseph didn't lose sight of that, right? And what he saw was, there's something bigger going on here. All of this happened to bring me to the point where all of that suffering came about so that I could come to save people's lives. What's cool about that, if I could encapsulate the Bible in one phrase. So lots of times we do that, right? If I could say one thing about the Bible, I do that all the time. So I hope nobody watches these 8 weeks, because they're going to be like, he said that 5 times. 5 different things. If you could pick one command in the Bible, what do you pick? Love God, love neighbor. That's typically, right? Jesus says that. So you pick what Jesus says. If I could pick one statement to kind of encapsulate the entire story of the Bible from beginning to end. God's story. What story is he telling us? I think this is probably pretty close to what I'd say. That love suffers to save lives, right? That's the gist. We see suffering after suffering after suffering. And the story that we read about from Joseph is just a picture of what Jesus goes through, right? Jesus perfects what we see Joseph go through. Joseph, who seems to be innocent and does nothing wrong and continues to suffer, and yet brought to the point where he can save all of these lives, and Jesus, beaten, accused, mocked, hung on a cross, fully innocent, and dies to save lives, right? He dies to save not physical lives, but spiritual lives. That's what the story of the Bible is all about. Love, true love. Oh gosh. That's a quote from that movie, isn't it? True love. True love. I have a way of interrupting really powerful moments. I'm sorry. True love often expresses itself in the form of one who is willing to suffer so that others don't have to. Let me say that again. True love often expresses itself in the form of one who is willing to suffer so that others don't have to. That's love. We've been talking about a lot of things over the last few weeks, a lot of things that we've seen God do. Some of them, I'm sure, along the way have made us uncomfortable in different ways. This one, I think, makes us uncomfortable a little bit too. That's what love is. Love suffers so that other people don't have to. The pinnacle of that love was Jesus on the cross, suffering for me and you so that we didn't have to suffer the fate of our own sin and our own choices. Perfect love. So I have 2 questions to close. The first question is this: are you willing to suffer for other people? Are you willing to put yourself out? Are you willing to lose an argument? Are you willing to be inconvenienced? Are you willing to give money? Are you willing to give the shirt off of your back? Are you willing to experience hardship so that other people don't have to show them love? Are you willing? And the second question is the more important one this morning. My question for you is this: when I asked you to think back over your life, who in this room right now has allowed that story to stand in the way of them and an authentic relationship with Jesus? Who is letting all of that junk convince them that, I just can't reconcile all of this stuff with God who loves me? And this is not a message just for those who might not believe in Jesus at all. It doesn't matter to me where you are in your faith journey. If you have a rough story or you've had a rough go, and you might not be Joseph and sold into slavery and all that kind of stuff, but you've had a rough go, and it's that stuff that you use to say, nah, I can't fully open up. I can't fully open up to God. I can't fully open up to a relationship with Jesus because that stuff is just too bad. Here's my question. Why would you distance yourself from the one person that understands that? Why? Jesus came to this earth, did nothing wrong, was hung on a cross and died. He experienced the greatest suffering that anyone has ever experienced. And if you have experienced suffering and you distance yourself from him, guys, that makes no sense. It just makes no sense. So here's my encouragement to you. If that's you, Jesus is the one person you should be opening up to. Jesus is the one person you should be pouring that stuff out to and saying, I don't understand this stuff, but I know that you were in it somehow. Help me, just like Joseph, to not get so lost in the weeds that I can't pull back and see all of the good things that you've been doing in me and with me and through me despite this journey. Because I don't want to get lost in all that. Don't distance yourself from Jesus. Go to him. Because he's the only person, honestly, the only person that can understand. I can't and nobody else can. Even the people that sit in the same support groups that you're in, even the people that had the same experience you had, they can't fully understand what Jesus understands. Go to him. Lay it at his feet and see what he can do with that. See what he can do with that. Pray with me, okay? Jesus, there are a lot of different folks in this room with a lot of different experiences, and we read the story of Joseph, and it's just so relatable, I think. Jesus, I pray that what we would strive to relate to is the parts where Joseph reveals himself as somebody who didn't lose sight of the bigger picture of what you were doing, who trusted you more than himself, more than his experiences, and more than the rough go that he had. I think we struggle with that a lot. And so I pray for each and every person in this room, and specifically for those that are taking that bad stuff and putting it in front of them as a barrier between you and them. And I pray that right now in this moment that they would decide to lay it down. That they would decide to let it go. And that they would decide to no longer use it as an excuse for a real relationship with you. You suffered like no one else. And you can understand our suffering like no one else. So I pray for those people in this room that are in that space. I pray for myself and the things that I have yet to let go. God, you're crying out to us, asking us to be near to you. Don't let us use those things as an excuse. Give us your perspective like Joseph had, and let us lay it down today. Today. Why go another day? It's just not worth it. Thank you for the story of Joseph, God, and for showing us that you work in all circumstances, and you suffered the greatest loss to save our lives. We're just so grateful. It's in your name that we pray. Amen.